Today on the John Ankerberg Show, Dr. Ravi Zacharias answers the skeptics. Ravi grew up in India, where his ancestors belonged to the highest caste of Hindu priests. But one day, he heard the words of Jesus Christ and became a Christian. He has gone on to become one of the most brilliant Christian apologists in the world, traveling to more than 70 countries and speaking at the most prestigious universities, notably Harvard, Princeton, Dartmouth, Johns Hopkins, and Oxford University. He addressed the writers of the Peace Accord in South Africa and military officers at the Lenin Military Academy and the Center for Geopolitical Strategy in Moscow. 3 times he's been invited to speak at the annual prayer breakfast at the United Nations in New York, and he has addressed the national prayer breakfasts in the seats of government in Ottawa, Canada, and London, England, and spoken at the CIA in Washington, D.C. Join us today for this special edition of the John Ankerberg Show. Welcome to our program. I'm John Ankerberg. I'm glad that you joined us today. And my guest is the brilliant Christian philosopher, apologist, Ravi Zacharias. Ravi has talked to more university students in more countries than anybody I know. And I've asked Ravi in the weeks to come to speak to folks in different regions of the world. And starting next week, we're going to answer the questions of college and university students from the Far East. Then we're going to move to questions from students in the Middle East. And then we're going to go to questions from Europe and then from students here in America. So that's kind of the outline. And Ravi, I'm really glad that you're here. And I want to come back to a question that you were asked to present at Harvard University. And these lectures were so well received that they actually became a book. And the question they asked you to answer was, can man today live without God? And if you folks in the audience are listening right now, if I asked you, is our culture jettisoning God? Are we disregarding him? I think you would agree, yeah. And our university students are saying, I can live without God. I want you to especially listen to what Ravi has to say today in answering this question. Ravi, we're glad that you're here. Start us off.
This question goes back across centuries. In fact, when you open the book of Genesis, right from the beginning, the whole question, I think, of deciding to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, how God had phrased it and how the tempter phrased it. God reminded humanity that if you did that, in that day you will surely die. And the tempter comes and says, no. In the day you do it, you will become God. See, 2 completely opposite perspectives. And what was at stake here was, who's going to play God? Are you going to play God, or are you going to allow God to be God? So the question goes back right from the dawn of creation. And now we attempt to live that way. And all of a sudden we are finding out that there are no fences left. There are no points of reference left for definition. And I see this happening globally, and the world is in chaos. The whole question, can we live without God, whether we like it or not, is haunting us in government, in families, in the academy, and as we are raising it for our personal lives. G.K. Chesterton said, whenever you remove any fence, always pause long enough to ask why it was put there in the first place. So the moral law struggle has gone back across time. It's a struggle you and I live with every day in our choices. And when you have God in his person, having revealed himself through the Bible as I see it, the Old and the New Testament, who has defined that the law is for our benefit, it is for our well-being. That's why David says, I will delight in your law. Those who turn their backs upon the law, I have a very simple illustration for them in the mildest form. It is an old rabbinic expression. God is like the light. Blessing and success, prosperity issues are like the shadow. If you walk towards the light, the shadow will follow you. If you turn your back upon the light and chase the shadow, you will never, ever catch up to it. And that's why I think it is so critical, even to our audience, to those of you who are listening in. Every decision you make, ultimately is based upon that commitment or the absence of commitment to God. Your moral reasoning, your familial choices, how you spend your money, how you deal with in business, how whether people can take you at your word or not, all of those issues are built upon the foundation of your belief or disbelief in God. That's why you go back to the encyclopedia, the great books of the Western world, the longest essay is on God. And when Mortimer Adler was asked why, he looked at Larry King, the questioner at that time years ago, and said, Larry, because more consequences for your life follow from this one issue than any other issue you can think of. So you're spot on. And I believe that's the question that needs to be answered.
You say that there are 4 things that we are going to miss if we leave God out of our life, if we think that we can live without God. Let's take those 4 things. What's the first one?
The first one is an absence of a point of reference for moral decision making. There is no more a non-take referent, as the philosopher will say it. There is no more objective truth. There's no more an absolute. Let me give an illustration to the listener, for example. I come from India, where traffic is the topic of songs. You know, they say you live here in Bombay and it's dodge and bob and weave and all of that. But when you come to a red light, what is it telling you? Stop. Now, some people might think it's telling them it's Christmas and they keep going, but it's actually to tell you to stop. Now, when you're at that stoplight and you're daydreaming a bit and you see the car in the next lane and you're wondering whether he's moving or you're moving, what is it you really do at that moment? Instinctively, you go for the brake because the light is red, you can't move. Now, when you are not sure after you put your foot on the brake whether you're moving or the other person is moving, what do you do next? You look out of the window, look for a tree or look for a building, that which is not supposed to move, and measure yourself by that. Now, that is the indicator of an absolute, something that is immovable. I like to give another illustration. It's a clockmaker in Leicester, England, who found this man stopping outside his shop every day, synchronizing his watch with the clock. So one day he looked at the man, he said, what do you do this every day for? He said, well, I'm embarrassed to tell you this. I'm the timekeeper in the factory nearby. At 4 o'clock, I have to ring the bell every afternoon. At the end of the day, my watch doesn't work very well, so I synchronize it with your clock every morning. And the clockmaker says, that's really funny, sir, because actually my clock doesn't work very well either. I adjust it with the bell from the factory at 4 o'clock every afternoon when I hear the bell ringing. What happens when 2 wrong watches are synchronizing themselves with each other? One will have to pardon the grammar, but they'll get wronger and wronger every time. When there's nothing immovable, when you're synchronizing it with that which itself is such a reciprocal way of doing things, you will end up with a culture in total chaos. There's no absolute, there's no point of reference. That is precisely the moral framework. And there's one statement I will never forget from Auschwitz, walking through from room to room and seeing Hitler's statement outside the gas chambers, which said, I want to raise a generation of young people devoid of a conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel. That, to me, is the logical outworking of relativism. And those who trumpet the triumph of relativism have to realize that is the slippery slope on which we step when we do away with the absolute.
Yeah. What was the second thing that we lose if people jettison God? If they say God does not exist, or I'm going to live as if God doesn't exist, there really is no meaning in life.
That is the most existentially felt reality with the absence of God. And those of my fellow countrymen in India, the young people especially, will understand this very well. We are looking for meaning. There are songs that are sung in the popular Indian movies that ask for meaning. What does life really mean? I'm not God, I'm not the devil, I'm a human being, but what does that mean? To find a coherent set of answers, John, to the existential questions of life, that's what brings meaning into my own soul. The Greeks would talk about it as sort of harmony. Now we talk about it as sort of coherence with the culture, or we use sociological terms like shared meanings of the past, all of these are anchored to one idea, that in my life I have found meaning. And to me, the irony is the most successful, even the most wealthy, will tell you they're still looking for it. Sort of Lee Iacocca, the tycoon from the days of automotive success in his life, he said, here I am in the twilight years of my life, still wondering what it's all about. I know this, he said, fortune and fame are for the birds. Jack Higgins, I've learned that when you get to the top, there's nothing there. Boris Becker, the great tennis player, who said, you know, his biggest struggle was still with suicide, having attained all these trophies. The loneliest moment in life is when you have just experienced that which you thought would deliver the ultimate, and it has let you down. To me, as a 17-year-old, that was the question. Moral issues and all, yeah, they were all theory. But existentially, what does my life really mean? Why am I here in this world? What have I accomplished? And what is life beyond the grave? So meaning is the existentially relevant issue to which Jesus Christ really speaks and brings me back into a relationship with him from which I define all other relationships.
I love the story of you when you were speaking in Manila, in the Philippines, and a young man stood up in the back of your lecture when you were talking about, does life have meaning? Tell what happened.
Yes, I finished my talk, and this guy just springs up. You know, I like to give them at least one ground rule, which is keep your question brief and one question per person. But he just shouted out, he said, everything in life is meaningless. I said, that's not true. You don't mean that. He said, yes, it is. And we went back and forth. I said, no, you don't mean that. He said, yes, I do. I said, say it again. He said, everything in life is meaningless. I said, you don't really mean that. He said, I do. Who are you to tell me I don't? I said, all right, let's have this interaction remain standing. I assume that you assume that what you just said was meaningful. Am I right? And he just paused. I said, because if what you just said was meaningful, then everything is not meaningless. On the other hand, if everything is meaningless, what you just said was meaningless too. In effect, you've really said nothing. You're free to sit down. And you know, he just stared at me, John, like I'd sort of stabbed him in the chest. And what's a true part of the narrative is, to continue, as I finished and we were walking out, I saw this guy standing at the back, pacing the floor. If what I just said was meaningful, then everything is not meaningless. So I went over to him, put my arm around him. I said, I know what you're struggling with. I said, I know why you're saying it. I said, do me a favor. I'm speaking at a local church tonight. Why don't you come? And I'll give you some private time after that. He came. And John, when the invitation was given that evening to trust Jesus Christ, he was the first to step out of one of those seats there, walk up to the front, drop on his knees at the altar, and surrender his life to Jesus Christ. This is what Jesus meant when he said, I'm come that you might have life more abundantly, which put simply means he puts it all together to bring you the wealth of your inheritance as a creature created by God.
Yeah, God gives us moral absolutes. He also gives us meaning in life. But there's two more. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I'm going to ask Ravi to talk about the fact that without God, there's no hope. And without God, there's no recovery. You'll want to hear this, so stick with us. We'll be right back. All right, we're back. We're talking with Ravi Zacharias, who has talked to probably more university students about the Christian faith than anybody else that I know. He's traveled to 70 countries. He goes to at least 12 countries every year, does 5 round-the-world trips every year. How he does it, I don't know. And he speaks in these pressurized situations to the intellectuals of our time. And Ravi, we're talking about, can man live without God? If people choose to live as if God doesn't exist, there are ramifications. Give us a summary of where we're at, and let's continue.
The question that I think is the reigning question of our time. All the others are really footnotes to this question. Can man live without God? And I did actually 2 lectures in Q&A, and the third one, I had other panelists join me from the student body. It was a fascinating third session, and then went into print as a book, Can Man Live Without God? My 4 points were that, and I think there are actually a lot more, but if you take just these 4 that define our lives, I said the loss of a point of reference for moral absolutes, that you really are governing your own life by whatever your conscience tells you or what your intuition tells you. Now, the problem with that is, in a world with so many different cultures, so many different religious perspectives, so many different forms of education, you're on a collision course at that point, because what is good for one may be a cursed thing to another, and vice versa. So we need to have a moral absolute that is objectively true for all of us. Is it objectively true to say, I have no right to take a sword and lop off another person's head, and do that with my own moral precepts and my own prerogatives, and do it on display in public television and consider that a triumphalist thing? Is that morally right or wrong? What does our intuition say to us? Chances are somebody listening is going to say, it's okay if it's revenge done by someone. Someone else is going to say, no, it's a horrific thing that you've done. What is the transcending point of reference to which we can point? Is it morally abhorrent to torture a baby for your own pleasure? And if so, where do we get that objective moral value from? So the fact of the matter is, we need an objective standard by which we point. Scientifically speaking, you can't have your own law of gravity, and I have my own law of gravity. You have your own law of thermodynamics, and I have my own laws of thermodynamics. No, there are specific laws and precepts that are given. So it is in a moral universe, which is what this world is. So we need that objectivity. Secondly, the question of meaning. Now, this becomes obviously more subjective, but not as readily as you may think so. Let me tell you why. Recently, a founder of an atheistic society against religion passed away. As you and I are speaking right now, it just happened a few days before. And interestingly enough, she was an atheist, followed the Bertrand Russell dictum that when she was put into the soil, her body was going to rot. That's what prompted her daughter to make the statement that for my mother, because death is the end and the body rots, therefore life is precious. And I found that fascinating. That's not what she was actually meaning. What she meant was her life was precious because she raised millions of dollars in the obliteration of other lives in the womb. And so I say, if you really think life is precious, what prompted you to fund the elimination of thousands of... Now, I know those are painful questions, but it is a legitimate question when somebody makes the statement that life is precious. So I believe life is precious, but I believe all of life is precious because all of life has intrinsic value, not extrinsic value given by government or state or culture. Now, the only way we can talk about intrinsic worth is if we are created by God Himself, an entity of essential worth. Life can only have meaning and purpose if life has essential value and then has purpose and significance. So I think these two realities for the non-theist or the atheist or the anti-theist are really unanswerable questions. Oh, I know they try to answer them, that we have to live and let live. You've seen what tolerance has done in our time. What it really means is A's view is valuable, B's is dispensable. No. In a true world of tolerance and acceptance, we have to respect each other's views and dialogue on that meaningfully, because life is meaningful. So I believe in knowing Jesus Christ, He who is my Savior, who laid down His life for me and was willing to offer love and forgiveness for me who never even sought after Him, but He pursued me, quote, like the hound of heaven. And there in that hospital bed, as I tried to take my life, found out that my life was meaningful not because I was an A student or a B student or a C student, but my life was meaningful because I was a creature created imago Dei, in the image of God. My moral reasoning and my essential worth comes to me from my Creator. That alone enables me to pursue His purpose and His pattern and His design for my life.
Yeah, Jesus Christ also gives us hope beyond the grave, and without Jesus Christ, you have no hope beyond the grave. Talk about that.
This is very real. I've attended so many different funerals. in Thailand, in India, in South America, Middle East, other places. What happens when a person dies? You know, some will say just bury them before sunset, and yeah, this is the ritual and so on. Others will just sit around the corpse and say nothing. There's silence. It is interesting that Oscar Wilde, who was the quintessential hedonist, at his funeral, by the way, which was held in the same church in Paris where Pascal's funeral was held, you know, to do the research and find out there was no music. Imagine in a pleasure-driven life, there was really no music at that funeral. And on his gravestone is a verse from the book of Job. Hope is something we all long for. And John, it's important that the listener follow this, not only because I want to find meaning beyond the grave, but if there is no life beyond the grave, what happens to justice? What happens to the person who has committed atrocities and then just puts a bullet to his or her head? And is this all over? Is there no balance to be set straight afterwards? So hope is not just a particular need in my life for me to see life beyond the grave or to see my loved ones again. It has to do with the quintessential question of justice as well. In Jesus Christ, this is the most beautiful thing about the gospel. The resurrection from the dead, the transformation of three lives. Thomas, who sees the risen Lord, ho kuriosmu, ho theosmu, my Lord and my God. The transformation of Saul of Tarsus to the Apostle Paul, who writes 1/3 of the New Testament, and then his brother James. Hope beyond the grave redefines everything. Billy Graham was talking to Konrad Adenauer once. As Adenauer was looking out of the window, Dr. Graham told us the story around a table. And Konrad Adenauer looked at him and said, Mr. Graham, do you really believe Jesus Christ rose again from the dead? And Billy Graham said, Mr. Adenauer, if I didn't, I would have no gospel to preach. He said there was silence. And then Konrad Adenauer said, you know, Mr. Graham, outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I know of no other hope for mankind. And to those of you who are listening to me, the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead is defining for everything. Let me just say one more thing to you about that. If Jesus were a charlatan, do you know what he would have said? He would have said, I will spiritually rise again. How do you falsify that after you find the body? He said, no, I am bodily going to rise again. That bodily resurrection was the concrete empirical evidence and the genuineness of the sincerity of the truth of Jesus Christ. I know when I die, I will be with him and also be with my loved ones who have known him and trusted him. Trust him where you are. He gives you hope not only for the future, hope for now, meaning for now, and the moral ground on which to define your life. You see, ultimately the problem is not morality. Jesus Christ didn't come into this world to make bad people good. He came into this world to make dead people live. We are dead to God. He makes us alive to him. You can find that hope in him.
Folks, this is tremendous stuff, and there's more to say, and we're going to probably cover this in the weeks ahead. But next week, we're going to turn to a very, very interesting topic. There are very brilliant students in all parts of the world, and they come at these questions differently, and they're really searching. And I want to go back to Ravi's homeland and other countries in the Far East. So questions, university students, the questions that they have about God that they have proposed to Ravi, I'm going to take some of the very toughest ones and ask him to answer them next week. And so I think you're going to find this fascinating. Hope you'll call a friend and tell them to join us for the broadcast, and I hope you'll join us then.
Stay tuned for scenes from next week's program. If you would like to have all of the information in our new series, Ravi Zacharias Answers Skeptics. In this series, Ravi describes how he grew up in India, where his ancestors belonged to the highest caste of Hindu priests. In a land of 330 million deities, he often pondered life's meaning, but finally lost hope and attempted to take his own life. While in the hospital, a man gave him a Bible, and he read Jesus' words, "Because I live, you shall also live." He then gave his life to Jesus Christ and went on to become one of the most brilliant Christian apologists in the world. In this series, he also answers the question, can man live without God? And summarizes a lecture series he was asked to give at Harvard University. And then third, he answers the most asked questions he receives from students in the Far East. Then, our second series is called Ravi Zacharias Answers Questions from Europe, the Middle East, and America. Aren't all religions basically the same? Isn't Jesus just one of many prophets? Isn't it unfair to claim that all the people who lived before Christianity are damned to hell? Is the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, that God is both one and three, a violation of the law of non-contradiction? If God is all-powerful and all-loving, why would he choose to create a world he knew would fall apart and bring so much evil and suffering? Please remember that you may watch today's episode free on our John Ankerberg Show app or at our John Ankerberg Show website at jashow.org. Or if you wish to keep these programs for yourself, each half-hour program is available as a digital download for only $5 an episode at our website at jashow.org.
With that, all religions simply cannot be true. So I've heard people say religions are all fundamentally the same and only superficially different. Skeptics normally say that. It's the opposite. They are fundamentally different and at best only superficially similar. Islam is not the same as Hinduism. Christianity is not the same as Islam. We need to be cordially able to interact on these issues without anathematizing each other, but holding on to truth. Truth is ultimately incontrovertible. Why can't all religions be true? Because the law of non-contradiction applies to reality. Two contradictory statements meaning opposite things cannot both be correct at the same time. Exclusivity is a reality in truth because truth is primarily a property of propositions. We see this in a courtroom. Were you in the room when this took place? The answer is either yes or no. You can say 1 foot in there, 1 foot out of there. You can play word games, but the questioner is looking for truth.
Now, possibly, God is speaking to you today. And if you would like to have someone pray with you, or you have a question you would like to ask, there's a phone number on your screen right now that you may call. Call that number, and someone will be happy to pray with you. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that you'll join me again at the same time next week.
And to learn how to start a relationship with Jesus Christ, go to our website at jashow.org and click on Pray to accept Jesus Christ as your Savior.